Imagine driving down a quiet road, heading home after a long day, when out of nowhere, your life is turned upside down. This is exactly what happened to Sarah and her young daughter, Lily, one fateful evening. But what makes this story even more shocking is not just the crash itself, but who was behind the wheel and how far he was willing to go to cover up what he'd done. Today, we're diving deep into a story of lies, betrayal, and how one man's reckless choices came back to haunt him in ways he could have never imagined. Stay with us till the end, because you won't believe how this all unfolded. It started like any other evening for Sarah. She was a single mother, juggling a demanding job, taking care of her 6-year-old daughter, and trying to keep their lives in some kind of order. That evening, they had just finished Lily's gymnastics class and were on their way home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streets were dimly lit. But Sarah wasn't worried. This was a route she had driven 100 times before. As they turned onto the main road, Sarah glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror. Her daughter was humming softly, staring out the window at the passing lights. That was when it happened. Without warning, a car came barreling out of a side street, swerving uncontrollably. It was moving so fast that Sarah didn't even have time to react. In a heartbeat, the car slammed into the side of Sarah's vehicle, sending them spinning across the road. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air, followed by a deafening silence. For a moment, Sarah didn't know what had happened. Her ears were ringing, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. Lily's terrified scream broke through the fog in her mind. "Mommy! Mommy!" Sarah's heart raced as she turned to check on her daughter. Thankfully, Lily was shaken, but unharmed, secured by her seatbelt in the back seat. Sarah let out a shaky breath of relief, but that relief quickly turned to horror when she realized that the driver of the other car, whoever had caused this nightmare, was speeding away, disappearing down the street. In disbelief, Sarah tried to process what had just happened. A hit and run. Her car was smashed, her daughter was terrified, and the driver was gone. Panic set in as she fumbled for her phone to call for help. Within minutes, the police arrived, followed closely by an ambulance. Sarah and Lily were checked out by paramedics. Thankfully, neither had any serious injuries, but their car was totaled. It was a miracle they had survived. The police officers at the scene were sympathetic but focused. They asked Sarah for details about the other car, but everything had happened so fast, she barely had time to register the make or model. All she could remember was a flash of headlights and the gut-wrenching feeling of being hit. The officers promised to look into it, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that justice might never be served. Hit-and-run cases were notoriously difficult to solve, especially when the driver vanished without a trace. She felt powerless, but she had no idea just how deep this story would go. A few days later, Sarah received a call from the police. They had found the car involved in the crash. It belonged to none other than Officer Mark Ryan, a seasoned cop with a spotless record. Until now. When Sarah heard the name, her stomach dropped. A police officer had been the one to hit her and her daughter. And worse, he had fled the scene. Officer Ryan had denied everything. In fact, he claimed he wasn't even in the area that night. His story was airtight, or so he thought. He had an alibi, saying he was off duty at home with his family and had no knowledge of the accident. It was his word against Sarah's. But Sarah wasn't about to let this go. She hired a lawyer, determined to get justice for her and Lily. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge. Witnesses from nearby houses recalled hearing the crash and seeing a car speeding away. A surveillance camera from a gas station down the road caught a glimpse of the fleeing vehicle. And while the footage was grainy, it was clear enough to match the description of Officer Ryan's car. Sarah's lawyer pressed the case, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. But Officer Ryan remained adamant in his defense. He was a well-respected member of the police force, known for his integrity. He had friends in high places, and the case seemed to drag on, with every delay feeling like another slap in the face to Sarah and her daughter. Months later, the case finally made it to court. By now, Sarah was exhausted, emotionally, physically, and financially. But she refused to back down. She sat in the courtroom, heart pounding as Officer Ryan took the stand. He looked calm, composed, and completely confident in his lies. He stuck to his story, insisting that he had been nowhere near the scene of the crash. He talked about his years of service, how he had dedicated his life to protecting the community, and how he was being falsely accused. The jury watched him closely, hanging on his every word. But then, something happened that no one saw coming. During cross-examination, Sarah's lawyer presented a new piece of evidence, something that hadn't been disclosed earlier in the trial. It was a security camera recording from a nearby business, capturing the moments just before the crash. And there, clear as day, was Officer Ryan's car, driving recklessly through the intersection just minutes before the hit and run. The courtroom fell silent. Officer Ryan's confident facade cracked for the first time. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the footage playing on the screen. There was no denying it now. He had been caught in a lie. The prosecutor wasted no time. They hammered him with questions, exposing every inconsistency in his story. It wasn't just about the crash anymore. It was about his character, his integrity, and how far he was willing to go to cover up his actions. The jury was no longer looking at a respected police officer. They were looking at a man who had lied under oath, a man who had put his career and reputation above the safety of others. As the trial progressed, more evidence surfaced. It turned out that Officer Ryan had been driving under the influence that night, something he had tried desperately to hide. His colleagues, who had initially supported him, began to distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with him. The day of the verdict arrived, and Sarah sat anxiously in the courtroom, holding her breath as the jury filed back in. The judge asked for the verdict, and the jury foreman stood up, reading the words that Sarah had been praying for. Guilty. Officer Ryan was convicted not only for the hit and run, but also for perjury and obstruction of justice. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his life in shambles. He had thought he could lie his way out of the mess he had created, but karma had caught up with him in the end. For Sarah, it was a bittersweet victory. She had fought tirelessly for justice, and while the process had been grueling, she knew that she had done the right thing for her and Lily. The crash had left them shaken, but they had survived. And now, with the truth finally out, they could begin to heal. If there's one thing we can all learn from this story, it's that you can't outrun the truth. No matter who you are or how powerful you might seem, your actions will always catch up with you. And for Officer Ryan, the price of his lies was steep. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of justice and doing what's right, please show your support for people like Sarah and her daughter by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we can bring attention to the real-life stories that matter and hold those accountable who think they're above the law. Thank you for watching, and we can't wait to see your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for more powerful stories just like this one.